few technical problems connecting here. Janet?
Yes. Hello, everyone. I'm Janet Salmons, Research Community Manager for Sage Method Space. And I'm here from Colorado in the US, where I can see the Rocky Mountains from the office window. And we've got interested researchers online today from other parts of the world. So communication and collaboration were central to your topics of conversation in your meetings this week. And surely, in order to engage researchers to prepare for global crises that may be coming down the line, and to think in multidisciplinary ways, it's important to bring us together and engage us at this stage in your process. So I'd just like to thank you for making it possible for us to be there at the virtual table. And to our online participants, please let us know where you're logging in from today and post your questions and any links to resources or other ideas or materials you'd like to share. And I'd also just like to thank Sage for making this session possible. And if you are registered for this webinar component of the meeting, you will receive links to the recording and related posts from methodspace.com. So again, thanks for letting us join you, and look forward to hearing from the panel today.
Thank you very much, Janet, and thank you so much for making it possible again that we have a webinar with you. So live in the room here at the UNESCO are about 50 people and 6 speakers. We were hoping to connect to a speaker at Delhi Airport, but so far we haven't been able to do so. And we will start with an animation about an ethics policy brief. So over to Chris.
The Group of 20, or G20, is one of the most powerful international platforms today. It is made up of 19 countries plus the European Union. The G20 was formed to discuss key issues in the global economy. It has made important contributions on global health, corruption, debt relief, increasing women's rights, and more. G20 initiatives have an impact on the lives of billions of people. Yet only one of 55 African countries is a member of the G20, South Africa. Each year, another G20 member holds the presidency. In 2023, it is India. After a meeting in India, 11 high-profile authors from around the world came together to make an important proposal to G20 members: invite the African Union to a permanent seat. The invitation would support the trust values of fairness, respect, care, and honesty. By adding just one seat, 54 countries and 1.4 billion people would have a seat at the global table. The Sustainable Development Goals promise to leave no one behind. High-income countries borrowed $17 trillion at zero interest rates to cope with the COVID-19 pandemic. Lower-income countries paid high interest or had no access at all due to existing debts. The G20 has called for stronger global cooperation in the next global crisis. The next step is to follow through with the G21. Crisis can be a catalyst for change. We propose a G21.
What you have just seen is an example of taking ethical values to examine a particular policy question and then giving an answer that has an advocacy element. But I will now ask each person on the panel here to say why it's important to bring ethics into policy, and they will all introduce themselves. So over to Michael first.
Thank you very much, Doris, and good day, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Michael Makanga. I'm Executive Director of the European and Developing Countries Clinical Trials Partnership Association, and I'm based in The Hague in the Netherlands. And quickly to go on to the importance of introducing ethics into policy, I have to underline that if talking from the research perspective and talking as from the funder's perspective, all research need to be done with responsibility to have the results of the researchers with the end user in mind, and that is, in most cases, the people that are going to utilize the research. And consequently, it is an ethical imperative to avoid unnecessary delay or failure to translate research findings into policy and practice to ensure maximizing public health benefits. And with this, I want to base it on a values-based approach. When you look at this from the side of fairness, often it is important that the research that is done takes into account policy-relevant questions, and is also takes into account the context in which the research is done, with the end user in mind to ensure that they benefit. And this links the research to access to the products that are evaluated. And in this case, I want to use the very vivid example of the COVID-19 vaccines, the COVID-19 effective therapeutics as well, that where these are evaluated, that they are made available to the people that need them most, irrespective of their settings. And this is an ethics question. On the side of fairness and care, if you allow me, I want to use another example, and that is the Ebola vaccine evaluation. We had the situation in West Africa and the situation in Central Africa. And because of having ethical values in the construction of the research, when promising Ebola vaccines were evaluated and introduced, we had the largest study that involved 1,400 children that were in the control arm that did not receive any Ebola vaccine. After getting ethical approval, out of fairness and respect and care, these children now have received the effective Ebola vaccines, and they're being followed up to 5 years. This is care and introducing ethics into policy and practice. Over.
Fantastic example. Thank you very much, Michael. I also had the good news, just that we have our colleague who is at Delhi Airport. I hope that's correct. Can you hear us, Sachin?
Yes, I can hear you.
Fantastic. Over to you before your gate closes.
So, yeah, thank you. Thank you, Doris. Thanks a lot.
Can you introduce yourself, Sachin, because we didn't know whether you would make it.
Thank you. Thanks, Doris. I am Sachin Chaturvedi. I am heading a think tank in New Delhi called RIS, which is Research and Information System for Developing Countries. It's a think tank dedicated for South-South cooperation, and it focuses on issues related to the interlinkages between trade, investment, technology, and finance. So how these four dimensions influence each other, and from that perspective, how exclusions happen in the global economy. And we try to focus major issues that are related to exclusions and in what way we can bring in the larger sections of the global South in several of these platforms. So that gives a broad idea about our work program. Being part of the G20 presidency group, I am also heading the Think 20, the T20 in India's G20 presidency. Thank you, Doris.
Thank you very much, Sachin. What we would be interested to hear from you is the emphasis on the G20 presidency of India trying to push for ethics into policy.
Thanks, Doris. There are three things that we are trying to do in terms of identifying the broad priorities of the G20 presidency of India. One definitely is, as the very opening statement of the Prime Minister articulated, world is one family, the emphasis on one future, and the idea that we are having only one planet. So this opening statement of our G20 presidency is trying to bring in all different continents together and trying to see this great message from Gandhi coming forward in terms of the idea of one world. And from that perspective, what is it that the G20 members can do together for bringing in Africa in the focus? And that's where the G20 ministers meeting, foreign ministers meeting in Delhi in March, addressed in their resolution to bring Africa closer to the idea of the better governance in the world. The second priority is to have women-led economic development, and this is something where it's not just about gender mainstreaming, but it is about women-led economic development, which is India's G20 priority. The third is to accelerate sustainable development goals. We have seen how COVID crisis and the impending debt crisis have adversely affected several countries. So how we can collectively move forward and bring everyone together in this endeavor. The idea is to encourage countries to see the possibilities of resource mobilization, resource sharing, and also strategizing how technology and the gap that is there in SDGs can be bridged. So we are part of a major project where UNESCO is also in hand with us, which is about STI for SDGs, Science, Technology, Innovation for promoting Sustainable Development Goals. So we are taking that forward. The last, Doris, with you, the policy brief that we could launch to bring in the idea of making G20 as G21 and inviting African Union as a member in the G20 community is something that is going to go a long way, I suppose, in terms of how we go forward and how we bring in this most important continent on the table. Thank you, Doris.
Thank you so much, Sachin. So you focused on 3 points, the policy of India to talk about one planet. That's something we've been doing here all day as well. Also talking about solidarity. Then you talked about the SDGs and all the work that is left to do. At the meeting in India to which you invited me, somebody said, this is no longer about leaving no one behind. The pandemic has pushed millions of people behind. So there is a lot to catch up. And then thanks for your support for the G21. Of course, you're the first author. So I would like, if that's okay with you, Sachin, I would like to go to another speaker now, but if you could hang on for as long as you can, in case people have questions for you.
Thank you.
And in that case, over to Liana Snyders now, and also introduce yourself. And why is it important to bring ethics into policy?
Yeah, good afternoon. My name is Liana Snyders. I'm the director for the San Council of South Africa, and we represent the San people of South Africa. For us, why it is important for policymakers to include ethics is because of exclusion. As a vulnerable population, we've always been excluded and people always take decisions on our behalf. But sometimes when you stop and you rethink and you ask a vulnerable population, what do they think about climate change? What do they think about the environment? What do they think about conservation? Then you get the solutions. But excluding them always remains a problem. If we go to the Agenda 2030, we have the leave no one behind. And that is exactly what it is. So when you make policies, when you do briefings and whatever, always include the people that you discuss about and try to find solutions of. And I want to take you, why I'm saying that is that I want to take you to our SEN Code of Research Ethics. So when we developed the SEN Code of Ethics, the question was, what do you want? And we always said, we don't want to be exploited. But now the question is, what do you want? And that gave us the power as the community to decide, because everything we do on a value system. Indigenous peoples always do something on a value system, and we care. So if you bring in that part of the ethics into the equation, you will have a fabulous document. And when it comes to implementation of that document, because we use a bottom-up approach, it works for us because we take ownership of implementing that document. So always it's important when you talk on behalf of somebody else to ask the question, are we going to treat them fair? Do we treat them with respect? Will they always care about the communities? So these are the fundamentals that Indigenous peoples work on. And if we bring it into policy making, even if we are not there, we will not be left behind, and our interests as an Indigenous community will be looked after through the value system that we value. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Liana, for emphasizing the very important thing that bringing ethics into policy will potentially tackle exclusion. Thank you so much. And we now go to Catherine Littler, also introducing herself, please.
Good morning, good afternoon. I'm assuming good evening. I'm Catherine Littler. I'm the co-unit head of the Health Ethics and Governance Unit at WHO in Geneva. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's a great pleasure to follow Liana. I think I'm going to make 3 points. There's obviously overlap with the 3 previous speakers. The first thing I think is important, I think it's everybody in this room understands this, but everything to do with research and global health research is intrinsically ethical by nature. And a lot of what we're focusing on is ethics from the ground up to the high level. So the question of who decides, so research priority setting agendas, that is an ethical question. It's often not seen by as that, either by the people who are doing it as a methodology or the decision makers who are taking that decision in the first place. That's fundamentally ethical. We talk about in the research ethics process, social benefit. That's fundamentally ethical. And actually, we saw some great examples of the translation of social benefit into policy uptake in COVID, the fast translation and the turnover. And learning from that, I think, is critically important. Whilst I'm on ethics review, I think that's part of our greatest strength and our greatest weakness as a community. It's a fundamental bit of ethics and the research pipeline, the ethics review process. But if it's often the only bit of the pipeline that people focus on when they think about ethics, they don't think about the bigger ethical issues. And I think that's where we have a translation issue that's part of our challenge to address. How do we get people to understand that research ethics review is fundamental, but it's a small part of the process and we cannot over-rely on it. We really need to get some of these bigger ethical issues unearthed and on higher level agendas. There's a logical argument as to why we would have ethics translated into policy and decision-making. If I'm arguing everything's ethical, everything's political, it's often economical, you have an economics advisor, you often make a decision on a political basis. Why wouldn't you therefore have an ethics advisor if it's an ethical decision? And I think we need to come back to that as in the struggles with being able to get appropriate ethical advice. So I think there's a logical argument. Thirdly, from a WHO perspective, we're currently in our Global Work Programme 13, which ends in 2025 and is linked to the SDGs, which we've already heard about. Within that document, ethics is mentioned multiple times, but it's particularly mentioned in the sense that it says states the WHO must ensure that policymakers and implementers keep ethics at the heart of decision making. So it's there as a role that we should be focusing on the uptake. Finally, we heard a lot from global leaders on issues of ethics in the pandemic. Solidarity, equity, access, fairness. Where we achieved those and where we didn't is a big issue as to why. I mean, there's big issues around collective issues. There's big issues around injustice, inequality. But the fact that we had global leaders using terms that they wouldn't have used 5, 10 years ago is something. But it's one step. I'd argue there's also a moral imperative from our community to ensure that they are using that ethical language appropriately. And they understand the context, they understand solidarity, they understand equity. So there's a job for us to better define it. And in order to do that, we need to work with policymakers. And I'll finish there and hand back to you, Doris.
Thank you so much, Catherine, first for starting by explaining that already there is an ethical aspect in many of the things that are happening, especially in global health research, and then by ending to say there is a role for us to talk to global leaders so that when they use words like solidarity, etc., they use them in such a way that it will also have an impact. I can see now that we've got a contribution from South Africa. Perhaps, Janet, you can just read the comment from Cherry.
Cherry was observing that what she's hearing seems to align with the Canadian policy for First Nation people of the acronym is OCAP, owner, control, access, and possession in terms of research ethics. So, these, seem to be, good principles to think through. And Cherry, do you have any other questions about that? Would you like the panel to discuss any of those?
We could also go to the last speaker we have on the panel here in this first round, and then open for questions both in the room and online. But first, for Lisa to have an opportunity to introduce herself.
Hello, very good day, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting us. I'm Lisa Diependalen. I work as a policy officer for the ethics and research integrity sector of the European Commission. And I just want to say what a privilege it is to be here, and also very humbling to be here among a group of people that really actively works to use the words of Dr. Feinholz of yesterday, to give a microphone to people who are in urgent need of one. So there were a couple of small thoughts that I wanted to share with you in the context of why do we need to bring ethics into policy making and why it is important. And I already mentioned it to my co-panelists. This feels a bit like preaching to the converted, because I think you are already all very much convinced that this is necessary. But I wanted to just highlight a couple of things that I've seen and that we have in the context of our work been thinking about. The first thing is that one of the reasons that I think that many of the policy briefs that come out of research ethics and research integrity projects that are funded by the EU under various programs provide really important policy advice. And I think this is the case because the research ethics and research integrity community, by its close involvement in research, are very often the first ones to really reflect on new ethical challenges that we are faced with. And in that sense, I think the research ethics community should really be more vocal about this unique position that you find yourself in being really the first kind of mechanism to deal with really complex questions, to deal with situations of uncertainty, and to try and hope to do that in an ethically responsible manner. But also in other areas, when we're not talking about new and emerging technologies, research ethics committees are very often confronted with the problem of implementation and how difficult a good implementation of certain policies are. And if I look at the EU policy agenda, there's lots of focus being given now to the green and digital transitions. We put a lot of expectations and hope in the research community to deliver a lot that society needs to make progress on various fronts. But then to see really how difficult certain aspects of implementation are, also their research ethics committees and research integrity offices are in a very privileged position to really identify that in advance or very early onwards. So I also want to invite you or put the attention to some work of the European Group on Ethics in Science and New Technology. In 2021, they have published a statement of the role of ethics in European and global governance. And I think this statement really clearly highlights that how important values are in how we perceive problems, how we frame problems, but also how values interact with our imagination about what possible solutions are. So I think it's really important for the ethics community to use its unique skills to really push policymakers and push also the boundaries of their imagination and really inspire them to show moral courage as well. But I think indeed one of the big challenges that was already mentioned is also to make sure that in the perception of the outside world, ethics committees and ethics advisory committees and the ethics community as a whole, because I think we should not limit it to people who are effectively on certain committees. In many of the policy circles, they think about a very narrow set of bioethical issues. Yeah, okay, maybe I have to ask the opinion of a bioethics committee, but they don't really have that intuition when it comes to a lot of societal issues. So there, I hope that we can come to some sort of systematic assessment of what we now see happening with all the debates in artificial intelligence. There we have now a lot of use of the word ethics, maybe not always appropriate, in a policy debate that is not a typical bioethical debate. So I think it would be interesting for the ethics community to really reflect on what are we seeing here, what is happening, what can we learn from the increased use of the word ethics in this kind of policy debate, and how should guide us towards our further work. But as a last point, I also want to highlight that I think we need to work towards better integrating ethics into policy, but I think there already are some really very good examples that we should be inspired by. I think about, for example, the new initiatives on neurotechnologies and the agenda setting that the International Bioethics Committee played as a very wonderful example, but also the EGE with a very early opinion on artificial intelligence before it was kind of a hype topic. And I should maybe also remind you that the Trust Code also really made it into one of the Council conclusions of the European Council that was released last year. So, but with that, I will leave the other concerns over implementation for the next round. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisa, also for pointing out or giving an invitation to the ethics community here in this room, but also online to get more involved in policy, which leads to the next round, but we'll break for questions first. The next round will be about how do we do it? And also, as you pointed out, this is a converted audience, so to speak. People here in this room are interested in ethics. The people will have registered for the webinar as well. But so stay tuned for the part on how will we do it, and for a fantastic video from Peter Singer at the end. So first of all, I would now like to see whether there are questions in the room. If you switch on your microphone, you will be seen on camera. So if you don't want this, you can also give the answer to me. But I think the Chief of Bioethics, Daphna Feinholz, will probably not mind.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much, Sachin. It was a pleasure to see you. And maybe you know that also UNESCO is taking part actively in the G20 negotiations. So we hope that this request of becoming having African Union will go through. And I really want to thank all the panelists, because I basically agree with everything that you have said, but just wanted to be back to some of the issues that I think they're still very challenging. I cannot agree more with you, Catherine, that the review process of the research is just one little part, and ethics is about even what do we decide to do research or not, and who decides, and if it's even needed, etc., etc. But I think that the concept of ethics in general is really not very well understood. And it's very related to the discussion of this morning about values, that we were saying that values is what is driving our everything that we do. And I think when we explain this to people, because even when we say that health is basically a definition of values, because the definition of health has been changing, and it's only reflecting what we as society are expecting. Now we want to have everything, the perfect state of everything. And before it was only saving lives. So it's a value, even the definition of health is value based. So, and if you explain everyone that if you prefer to give vaccines to children than to older people, is because you are prioritizing the young than the olders. So I think explaining what it is really still a challenge and something to do. And we have the moral obligation, and it's not so easy, but I think when you give personal examples to people is becoming easier. And the other thing I wanted to say, because I don't want to monopolize, but the fact that some of these principles or words are used by global leaders is good, and sometimes by some private sectors as well. But I'm always very afraid that even if we do our work of explaining what it means, that they can be instrumentalized. And I just wanted to bring this worry, because sometimes it's just to bring the attention and just to play kind of the game that I'm in, but they are instrumentalizing them regardless of our good work trying to explain. So just wanted to say that.
So thank you so much, Daphna, for making a contribution from the UNESCO perspective also, or well, personal. Any comments? Because you basically agreed with most of the things that were said here. I don't know whether there are any comments. Yeah.
So I think the question on knowledge or understanding of ethics is an important one. We had a big debate in our COVID ethics working group whether we should stop using the word ethics and start using the word values. And it worries me that we have to back down as a community and not use the word ethics. But it would be interesting to see if we got better uptake if we did use different words. And language matters. I think one of the things I've truly heard today is that language matters. So another onus on us to think about that. And the instrumentalization, I think it's really important. That's why I think putting meat on the bones or putting explanations behind the use of the terminology is critically important, so they cannot be hijacked and used in an instrumentalist manner. And that's also very, I think, important when we talk about the second issue about how we do this. I think this one-size-fits-all model is not going to work in our area at all. We're going to have to come at this with very different instruments. So you may consider, for example, you want to have a checklist, but by definition, we all know what happens with checklists, but at least it gets people thinking through the issues. But if you have a checklist alone, it could be instrumentalized. So I think we really do have to think about a multiplicity of instruments and mechanisms for the way that we introduce ethics into policymaking.
Thank you very much, Catherine, also for suggesting that using a different word might help, because ethics should really be a word that people aspire to. But let me see whether there is another question from the floor, and then I'll hand over to Janet, because there are 6 questions online. any other brave person wants to switch? Kali? Yes. So that's Kali Krubiner, the bioethics lead from the Wellcome Trust.
Great. Thank you. This may be jumping the gun on the next portion of this session, but I had a question about operationalizing ethical imperatives in policy. So recognizing that that usually entails various different policy actors who may have different remits, different powers, different budgets, where the political dynamics, even of whether they're appointed versus elected, can be really different. What are some practical approaches for actually translating an ethical imperative into the policy sphere with so many different complexities and actors involved? Thanks.
I think that is the perfect lead into the next session, except that I would like to ask Janet whether she wants to summarize some of the questions from the online participants, and then the next session will answer Kali's question.
Well, we have one question that maybe is what you're planning to talk about next, but what would be the channel for results of data-based research to reach policymakers? So, and I think this is a good question that would be relevant to our method space audience and to people who'll be watching this video and, you know, want to engage more fully. You know, what channels can be used to share what they've learned from their own research, you know, in this kind of broader context.
Thank you very much, Janet. I will also give the floor to the others now, because that is also similar to the second part of the webinar. Only one thing, what we're talking about here is bringing ethics into policy. If you're a researcher in almost any discipline, you might have data that are relevant to, for instance, issues of fairness. So you might not have to work on fairness. You might not even have to define it in full, but you can contribute data on a question of fairness. So can you see that this is why bringing ethics into policymaking can happen from almost any discipline? And I'd like to go through the panel again, this time with the question, how do you have any examples, or how do you make it happen? And we'll stay with the same order, and starting with Michael. Oh, sorry, can we just say, just in the unlikely case that Sachin isn't on his flight yet, Sachin, are you still there? Because then you should obviously go first, but I think he's probably left.
Okay, thank you very much. This is a big question, and I'll use two examples to this. One is the one right at hand, and that is where a values-driven policy brief has been developed that argues for the African Union to be included in the G20 to promote the values of fairness, respect, care, and honesty. And this is done at the highest level globally, because this is something that will be deliberated on in the G20 circles. But this is something that is advocated for and would call for global support to take this forward. That is one way at the global level. And I'm glad, and I was very glad to be one of the co-authors of this policy brief. The other is on the side of the research itself. And on the side of the funders, this is something that can be built into the agreements that are made, especially where public funds are used, bridging the results that come out of the research to access, so that the people that need the results most access these benefits. Over.
Thank you so much. And over to Liana for any ideas on how to bring ethics into policy.
Thank you, Doris. So in the SAN community, in our code of ethics, we have that little small part that say process. And in the process, that is where you do the consultation, informed consent, and make sure that people are always part of the discussions. And we always use our value system. Like I said, again, Indigenous peoples is always about values. So if in that process, you already deal with the exclusion and you dialogue with people and you have consultations with indigenous populations, and that is how you should bring it into the policy making based on the values of honesty, fairness, and care. And if you exclude the values in that process system, then you leave people behind. And I'm going to share experience with you that we had. We had the case of the Rooibos benefit sharing agreement. So on the other side of the table, it's all about money, all about saving cost, and forget about the people, always forget about the people. And what we do is we use our value system to get the breakthrough, because one of our leaders just stand up and say, come on guys, stop this now. See us and hear us. And that was the breakthrough. So to be acknowledged first for our traditional knowledge and our argument always on our values in our process system, that was the breakthrough for the Rooibos, because we struggled to get the message over. But when we fall back on our value system and we incorporate it into our negotiation system, then we make the breakthrough. So always when we have the process, we need to assure that we build it on those values. And I can tell you, out of a Sun perspective, it worked for us. So bringing it in always work, and always have the process. Don't forget about the process, because the process is the implementation phase. And in that implementation phase, you make sure you leave nobody behind. And then we tackle the Agenda 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Liana. And for the audience, Liana also spoke about the biggest benefit sharing agreement under the Convention on Biodiversity ever signed. First industry-wide agreement was negotiated partly with 3 people who are in this room, and they have used ethics in their contact with policymakers, and they've had this amazing achievement with it. So that's another reason why it can work. Let me just answer one question that came online here before I hand over to Catherine. Somebody said ethics is reflective and qualitative, whereas bureaucrats and policymakers, they want quantitative data. So my reply with the example that we've showcasing here with the G21 is we've used data from economics to show, for instance, that the impact from climate change is much higher in Africa than the contribution to climate change. So with these figures, we could show that there is a major unfairness issue. So you can bridge metric data to ethics. But now I'd like to hand over to Catherine for ideas on how to bring ethics into policy.
So unsurprisingly, I don't have the answer, but also unsurprisingly, I have been thinking about this given my role. In December 2021, we held the first Global Pandemic Ethics to Policy Summit, trying to address what we could see was happening in COVID, that the ethics was not being translated into policy and decision making. And we brought together policymakers from around the world with ethicists, and we discussed what had worked thus far and what had not, and tried to have as an open and honest conversation as possible. We had some excellent examples where things worked really well. Some national ethics committees, their advice was really well taken up. Some national ethics committees felt political pressure and were worried about their position. We heard some really interesting examples from ethicists who were the sole expert on scientific advisory or government advisory groups. One, they felt their voice heard. Other times they were really worried that people kept saying to them, what's the answer here? Not what do you have to think about? You know, what are the deliberations? Let me help you think about it. So we heard some really interesting examples. We heard that in some settings it's valued, in many settings it's not. We heard in some settings there just isn't a lot of ethics expertise. A lot of that ethics expertise is focusing on research ethics review, and that may be right to a certain extent. So building on that work, I'm going to argue for an evidence-based and an experimental approach. So we are in the process of developing a major program of work within my unit. That program of work is going to look at 4 areas. Firstly, we want to do what we started to do in that discussion and what you're doing here, better understand the landscape, better understand what's happening across the globe in different settings, where there's ethics expertise, where the capacity is. So really understand the mechanisms, the models, the tools, the committees, those things that are out there and that are being used. Secondly, and this really does fit into your discussion about values, also understand the values that are being used out there. Which ones are being used in which settings? Are we being conflictual in our value use when we talk to policymakers? So really understand that, and that will be quite a large analysis. And then from there, once we've done that and working with experts and others, set up a group to really start thinking through processes. One of the things I think is critical that often gets overlooked is bringing multidisciplinary groups together. So what really struck me in COVID was comms. We had quite a large communication team at WHO, much larger than the 3 of us in the ethics and governance unit. But I think their communication, and we do have issues of infodemics and misinformation, disinformation. That said, I'm not saying that doesn't exist, but comms form such a important part of the messaging. So I think for me, the work that we will be doing is bringing together policymakers, comms people, researchers, and ethicists to really understand the language we're using, the dialogue, the way that we need to communicate, the tools people want. And part of that is also training for policymakers, training for ethicists in applied ethics. You know, my background is in ethics law and policy, and you write a 2-page document for a policymaker. You do not write, I mean, that's obvious, but how you construct that is very different to how you would even construct a summary of an ethics document. So to me, it's really important that we build a foundation and we work together on what that looks like. But it's a long-term strategy, so I don't have a short-term answer, but I think there's some great examples where things that have worked that we can build on. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Catherine, also for bringing communication to the table. So the last speaker on this round is Lisa, and then we will hear 2 short videos before winding up.
Thank you very much. Well, yeah, let me begin by stating that many of the points are so important, and I also want to make them, but I will try to filter my preparations a bit. I think when we go to implementation, I think one of the very first things that we need to do is really make sure that we communicate well to the policy community that is not directly engaged in ethics or in research ethics, that ethical advice, ethical deliberation, and an ethical analysis is really an intrinsic part of inclusiveness in policy making, of good governance practices, and of better regulation. Not to say that the ethics advice should have the final say, but it's an important part of the process, and it should be recognized as an important part of a qualitative and evidence-based policy making process. So from that perspective, I want to highlight that there might be a very interesting link to explore with the science for policy agenda. The pandemic basically resulted in the realization in many EU member states, but also in other countries, that there is a very diverse landscape in how scientific advice to policy making is organized, and indeed that it is not an unequivocally positive evaluation of how it is organized at all levels. So this has sparked at the EU level a debate on how can we better organize at member state level, at EU level, but also beyond that, how can we better organize scientific advice to policymaking? So this debate is now ongoing. It is scheduled for the June meeting of the European Research Area Advisory Committee, which represents the member states and the Commission. There will also be a conference in October dedicated specifically to science for policy and how this is best organized. And I think this is a really good opportunity also to highlight how important ethics and research integrity are when we talk about scientific advice to policymaking, how crucial it is, but also to start the reflection how this relates to ethical advice to policymaking. Because I think we can have a very long discussion whether ethical advice to policymaking and scientific advice to policymaking is one and the same, or whether there are some very distinct aspects to it. But I think it's an opportunity to really see how we can move this agenda forward. And in that context, I also want to highlight that 2 weeks ago in Sweden, there was a meeting of the National Ethics Councils Forum, which is every 6 months under the auspices of the presidency of the European Council. Representatives of the national ethics committees of EU member states, but also associated countries and other organizations come together to discuss a variety of ethical issues and topics. But in Sweden, the last week of May, they also had a dedicated session on reflecting what is the role of ethics advisory committees in the context of crisis. And also in that moment, our Deputy Director General really invited the ethics community to further reflect on what is needed at the EU member state level or at other states level, but also at the European level, to make sure that this is organized in an effective way, in an efficient way, and maybe also in a way that increases the visibility of what these national ethics committees do, and also how ethics committees, advisory bodies can better work together with scientific advisory bodies that work in policy advice contexts. So
thank you very much, Lisa. We're running slightly out of time. Thanks for giving the European perspective here. We've got 5 minutes left. Janet and we will come back to the people who've asked questions online, and we promise you answers afterwards if you are registered with your name. We are going to drop one video just to say that we have an endorsement for the G21 from Professor Marcel Tanner, who is the president of the Swiss Academy of Arts and Sciences. But without further ado, we'd like to listen to world-famous philosopher Peter Singer here before Janet will then wrap up. But any questions there are online, we will answer them later. So over to Chris to play Peter Singer's video, please.
Hello, I'm Peter Singer, Professor of Bioethics at Princeton University and the author of several books, including Animal Liberation Now, which has just been released, and I'm on a world tour promoting it. So, although I would have loved to be with you at the UNESCO meeting in Paris, unfortunately I had other prior commitments. But I am very happy to be a co-author of the G21 brief. And as my background is in ethics, I want to briefly explain why I support this brief. I think ethics needs to come into public policy at the global level, especially when we have a world that is divided between wealthy nations who have a lot of power, economic power included, and poorer nations who tend to be left out of a lot of important decisions. The G21 brief, of which I'm proud to be a co-author, suggests that we need to take basic values into account, like fairness, respect, care, and honesty. And also, I would add, we need to take into account the importance of reducing extreme poverty and of raising everyone in the world to a basic minimum level where they can have the needs that they have as human beings met. They can live in a basically decent condition, they can be respected, and they can feel listened to and a part of the world community. And it's hard to think of a more important step towards that goal than the idea of bringing the 54 nations of Africa, who are currently not part of the G20, into the G20 or G21 as it would then become, so that they have a voice, so that they can be listened to. It doesn't mean that they would have a deciding vote, but it does mean that they would be respected and they could be heard. I think that's a relatively simple step to take, but a very important one. I think that ethics requires the wealthier nations to take that step. We can say that we are doing things in the interests of the nations of Africa or of the less affluent nations all over the world. But if we're just taking them into account and making our decisions about them without listening to them, then I think there's something wrong. And we may be making the wrong decisions. I'm not saying that we always will be, but it's certainly possible. So let's take this important step. I thank all of my co-authors who've been putting this important document together. Let's advance it. Let's add these 54 nations to the G20 so that we have a G21 and can move towards a fairer world in which everyone is included, everyone is respected, and everyone has a voice in the most important economic decisions that will shape the future of the world. Thank you very much for listening.
So thank you very much to Peter Singer for recording this message on a very pressured world tour. And now I would like to hand over to Janet for the uninviable task of summarizing this rather time-pressed session.
Well, thank you all, for your comments. And, while I think about this, the larger scale of policy making and decision making that all of you are involved in, I also think about the people who are, kind of in the research, field as students and as those who supervise students and the next generation of researchers. And there are a couple of points that stood out to me from your comments. One is the importance of multidisciplinary collaboration. So, for those who are, working with students, teaching, how can we not only prepare people within the disciplines and the specializations that are important to their field, but also to build this awareness that, we need to bring in broader thinking. Just the thought of incorporating the Sustainable Development Goals, is a point that, brings us into contact with, a variety of scientific and social sciences disciplines. The other point that I felt was essential, to kind of research practice was, thinking about, ethics not only as something that is a part of a formal ethics review, but thinking, from the beginning of the setting of a research agenda. And these questions about who decides what problems get studied, whose problems get studied, in what settings, with what stakeholders, and with what voices. To me, are real ethical decisions. That ethics, values, whatever term you want to use, they're essential. And how do we communicate that to people who are just starting out in the profession? And similarly, how do we, as we're forming a research agenda, whether it's as an individual researcher thinking about what I want to achieve in my career, as a team, as a part of a a larger research institute, et cetera, how can we make sure that, the agenda is inclusive of the voices of the people whose problems are being studied? We certainly have things like action research and participatory research. Well, how can we learn from those kinds of methodologies to really put into practice these kinds of ideas? And then, thinking, the ultimate question that you're raising about policy and social benefits, to look at not only the scholarly contribution that research might make, but what are the practical sides that can come out of the studies that we do. So I hope that that this session and having the opportunity to hear from the panel will be helpful to those who have attended with us online today, and to those who will have a chance to watch the recording, and that some of these ideas will begin to influence some of the decisions that they make, so that as we foster the next generation of researchers, they can come with the mindset that will be helpful to contribute to the one world that we started out with. So again, thank you.
Thank you very much, and goodbye to the audience that is online, and to Janet and Chris. Goodbye from Paris.